So, Murray, can we start with the idea of where Jacobitism actually comes from, other than just a dynastic change of Stuart to Hanoverian?
Well, that's obviously the formal basis of it. It's a dynastic change, but I think that is also one of the ways in which we seriously misunderstand it. And there are two basic forms that Jacobitism takes. One is the English form, you might say, which is linked to distrust of the financial revolution and the development of very contemporary, of debt-funded war finance by the Bank of England after 1694, and also sympathies with High Anglicanism and Catholicism, particularly after the Georges come to power, and also a kind of anti-urban, anti-London country interest, and Scottish and Irish Jacobitism, which is really about reclaiming the late Stuart state. The post-1689 regime really centralised the British Isles very quickly. They got rid of the Council of Wales finally in 1694. Obviously, the Anglo-Scottish Union looms very large. They effectively, by suspending the Church of England Parliament convocation in 1717, they got rid of the independence of the Church of England. They even removed the Stannaries Parliament or Assembly from Cornwall. So we're looking at a very strongly centralising government regime, and in contrast with the late Stuart monarchy, which effectively, of course, continued Scotland and Ireland as independent or quasi-independent polities.
Well, how does that play out when you come to be a Jacobite? What is it actually like to be a Jacobite? How do you feel? How do you organise your allegiances?
Well, first of all, there are all kinds of Jacobites. I think one of the things that people get most wrong about Jacobites, again, it's a common error, is the idea that only people who actually take up arms are Jacobites. Just as if you were to say that only people who fight support a cause. A lot of people are Jacobites. Jacobitism appeals to a wide range of people. In Scotland, it appeals to smugglers because it's a way of getting out of excise duty. Obviously, they're getting out of excise duty anyway, but the Restoration, the Stuarts would see excise duty fall or disappear. So there's a whole subculture around Jacobite smuggling, which is really strong on the East Coast, and which leads to the very political way in which smuggling is dealt with in Scotland, how tender it is, and the biggest explosion around that's the Porteous riots in 1736. There are aristocratic Jacobites, some of them, like the Lees of Lyme Park in Cheshire, get round and kind of roll up their trouser legs and have a drink now and again. And some of them do a bit more than that and subscribe to the movement. And some of them are involved in the art trade. There's a big Jacobite art trade. So and there are a whole range of middle class, if you like, professional Jacobites, like, for example, lawyers who used to create problems for the York Buildings Company and any attempts to confiscate Jacobite estates. The Earl Marshal, for example, who was in exile from 1715, maintained a lawyer through 50 years, basically to contest areas of the Keith estates and to ensure that he had not the worst deal imaginable out of his estate confiscation and forfeiture. So there's a whole range, and there's also popular Jacobitism, particularly in Scotland and Ireland.
Well, one of the problems with Jacobitism, I suppose, is that it links up very easily to sedition and treason, all of which are things that you cannot encode or put into writing. You can't disseminate things immediately. You're off to jail, you're executed, whatever. So Jacobite culture has a coded subculture. You've written quite extensively about how people encoded their culture into objects.
Yeah, I mean, part of that, it's very important, first of all, because we hear a lot about the 18th century being the age of enlightenment and the age of the public sphere, the age of free debate, the age of freedom of the first freedom of the press. But actually, what you have to remember is the 18th century is a very oppressive society, that treason legislation is the extension of English treason legislation to Scotland is important, but also treason legislation is extended in the 1690s and 1700s, and uniquely sedition, that is an offence below treason, but one which foments political discontent, is actually treated as treason in England, partly because of the legacy of the 17th century and the Civil War. So actually, it's a formidable legal framework for prosecuting people. And avoiding that is absolutely imperative. Now, all treason legislation, right back to Edward III, which is the basis of English treason law, depends on the words. It depends on what you speak, or it depends, if you're really dim, on what you write. And of course, people today are just as dim in what they leave traces of on the web, as we've been finding out in the last week. But what you write is obviously a no-no, but even speaking is a real no-no. So you have to avoid those things. So you have to go for something else. What is it? Well, it's song tunes. You can't prosecute a tune. That's very common in popular Jacobitism, mobile Jacobitism, Chapman balladeers, pipers. Or you go, if you've got a big house in particular, you go for a statement. Sometimes the statement is quite grammatical. For example, at the House of Dun, the statement intensifies towards restoration as you go further into the interiors of the house. You have to remember that both the saloon and bedrooms were bedrooms to entertain intimates, were reception rooms in the 18th century. So actually these serve a function of reassurance, I'm one of you, of reinforcement, you're one of us because you're visiting me here, and also a statement which lies beyond prosecution, stuff you. So that's really what Jacobite symbolism is in essence about. Of course, some of them, like glasses, are slightly more explicit, and breaking the glass after the loyal toast is reflected in quite a few Jacobite songs, or even Jacobite rituals for feeding your dogs. For example, the Threeplet of Fingask papers, there's a Jacobite firing ritual of actually instructions to fire a musket is used to feed dogs on the estate.
I mean, House of Duns is very interesting because Erskine sort of commissions a whole vocabulary of architecture into the house. He is behind the first risings of the Jacobite thing, and has a banner which says no union on one side and has the Scottish arms on the other. So we're beginning to get an entirely separate culture here, different way of looking at everything.
We certainly are. I think Traquair is very notable for many things, but one of them is the white rose wallpaper, I think, which I'm particularly fond of upstairs. Those symbols were the articulation of a culture and a politics, and they're also commercial. I mean, for example, in the last 10 years, you can once again get from various suppliers Jacobite tartan, and the Jacobite tartan you can get, that red, yellow, and green Jacobite tartan, as it's called, in kilt shops or online suppliers, is the 1713 Edinburgh pattern. So that's what people wore in the run-up to the 1715 Rising, and you couldn't prosecute it. That's one of the reasons why after 1745 the British government was so annoyed about tartan, because tartan symbolized something. You couldn't actually prosecute it, but you knew damn well what it was, and that's why there was this very strong reaction, because they did 30 or 40 years of people going, na, 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 and it really, it really undermined treason and sedition legislation. And that also, Jacobite accessories were sold from very early date, first decade of the 18th century, scarves, gloves. Their white gloves were first designed in Edinburgh in 1710 with liberty in gold, ladies' gloves in the inside of the wrist. So you couldn't see the word liberty and whose liberty it was, who could tell. But it was a white glove, white being the colour of Stuart and Bourbon, liberty being support for the end of union, which was, of course, a core Jacobite political aim.
Women actually have quite a significant role in this, do they not? Because women considered to be politically less dangerous, less active, are slightly below the radar when it comes to some of these intimate declarations of political allegiance.
Unless they do men's work, and I put that in big inverted commas, because in 1697, for example, in London, Anne Merriweather was found guilty of printing seditious pamphlets, and she was sentenced to be burnt alive. She was not burnt alive, she was reprieved, but because she was involved in printing, she had moved outside the protected sphere of a woman. But actually, there are quite a lot of women, of course, involved in Jacobite risings. They often actually take up arms. I mean, there are, of course, famous cases like Anne McIntosh, daughter of Farquharson of Invercald, and the almost legendary Jenny Cameron. But one of the things that happens in the 45, and interesting this happens in Ireland in the 1798 Rising, is that part of the unnaturalness of the treason of the Jacobites is taken as the role that women occupy. So the unnatural female rebels, pamphlets like that are quite big sellers. People get very excited by Jenny Cameron pamphlets and stories. There's a special Harlequin pantomime put on in London in the 1740s, which shows Columbine as Jenny Cameron seducing Harlequin, Charles Edward Stuart. It's very much of that tenor. And there's a very interesting political print from 1746 called Tandem Triumphans, and it's in the Blakey collection in the National Library of Scotland. You can see it online, which shows British Army soldiers at bayonet point rounding up Jacobite women in the aftermath of Culloden. And this isn't irony. This is not an ironic anti-Cumberland print. This is, these women are dangerous. Soldiers should be rounding up with fixed bayonets. And that shows just how far the fear went and just how far the way in which British politics expressed itself had lost the plot in terms of what it would normally see as appropriate treatment of women in 1746.
And I'm quite intrigued by the way in which the perception of Jacobitism has changed. When I was an history student, it was fashionable to sort of play an historical endgame and look to the 1750s and 60s when it was known that Charles Edward Stuart would pass through London. The government did nothing, therefore it was trivial and it didn't really matter. Where actually everything that you're describing is that it mattered an awful lot, and that encoded behind all the individual manifestations of private and semi-public space of Jacobitism is a different view of government entirely. So are we looking here at more than just a counterculture of things, but a counterculture of political thought growing around a different view of how to organise yourself?
We especially are in Scotland and Ireland. The reason that English Jacobites tended to drink rather than fight is that their politics was much more diffuse. But what the Scottish and Irish Jacobites have wanted to do is to reinscribe the late Stuart state. And I think one of the things that's particularly relevant from this topic, which is now 300 years old, to the contemporary concerns of beyond borders, is that the late Stuart state or multi-kingdom monarchy actually created an alternative, there were other European examples, an alternative model for what is and what is not a state. So in a way it's correct, and in a way it's incorrect to call Jacobites in Scotland Scottish nationalists. Yes, they wanted to see an end to the Union. What they wanted to see was a multi-kingdom monarchy where some state powers, and I don't mean they were federal, but in the 17th century, though it didn't work particularly well for religious reasons, some state powers were invested in Scotland. Scotland, for example, founded its own colonies in South Carolina, East New Jersey, and infamously in Darien. But some state powers were also vested in England. And one of the key problems was the compliance of the London Parliament to Scotland's overseas ambitions. And that's what came to a critical head at Darien. So they actually allowed a situation to flourish where effectively Scotland was a separate state, but also it was joined on to a wider British Isles polity, and to a lesser extent that was true of Ireland as well. And if you look, we don't have time to go into the way that powers were segmented between London and Edinburgh in the 17th century, it's very interesting indeed. It's not a devolved system, it's not a federal system. The closest system to it now constitutionally is a confederal system, where certain things are held in common, but states have functioned as independent governments. So it actually was a model that failed for sectarian reasons, but actually a really interesting political model.
So is this why in a lot of Jacobite iconography there's constant looking back to the legitimate Stuarts, as the English might have seen it, in Charles I, Charles II?
That's true, but it's also something that was used as a discourse of false loyalism. So if all the Charles II stuff that was manufactured, a lot of it was after 1689, is basically saying, by the way, it's his nephew we're interested in, but you can't get us because look, it's Charles II. You liked him, okay? And so false loyalism is actually about reproducing images of the Stuarts who ruled to show that you actually support the Stuarts who don't. And that even happens with Queen Anne. An awful lot of Queen Anne material is created in the 1720s and 30s, often anti-Walpole, anti-government, and it is basically saying, actually, this was the last Stuart, what about another one?
And it's somewhat of an irony that the last Stuart was also the first monarch of a united Great Britain, really. I mean, how do you get, though, beyond this very nice world of things and objects where you can feel comfortable in your subjection to a political theory which actually puts your core principles into action? How did they think they would do that?
Well, they did that. They did that through a lot of routes which involved funding, and I think one of the things that's still underlooked at, under-examined, is the extent to which money was. I mean, money's at the centre of all political movements. You can't do anything without money. So the Jacobites had to find ways to effectively launder money from the continent into these islands, or raise money internally in these islands to take action. So there's a lot of fundraising. Some of it comes through the art trade. Some of it comes through sleeper agents. I mean, there's some Jacobites who get away with it all their lives. And one of those, for example, famous Edinburgh Jacobite, is Sir Alexander Dick of Prestonfield. Gets away with it all his life. But there it is. There's quite enough evidence to have convicted him. So these people they're sleepers, which were essential to the movement. And they're people involved in the various trade and exchange of the continental Europe that are essential to the movement too. What are they using the money for? They're using the money to sometimes, especially in the early stages, get votes to the House of Commons. They're using it to suborn people in conspiracies, and overwhelmingly, of course, in 15 and 45, particularly in 45, they're using it to buy arms. And so you get arms. Cannon, for example, 4-pounder cannon are landed in Orkney in 1743-4. They're bought in France and they're moved to Orkney. Orkney is one of the last places to hold out in 45 because the local Jacobite supporters are very entrenched and very well armed from an early date, and they're buying guns. It becomes more difficult to buy guns after 1715 because the British authorities kind of notice, or keeping much more of an eye on the fact you're buying guns. But it's one of the reasons why a Scottish militia wasn't allowed even as late as the 1760s, because the real fear all the way through the first half of the 18th century was if you create a militia to support the British government in Scotland and abroad, then they will be Jacobites. That's why the Black Watch were kept in the advance in 45. The Black Watch were kept down in London. That's why, actually, one of the big untold stories between 1745 and 1760, there's a very large British Army occupation of Scotland, about 12,000 troops, the same as the Irish establishment. And there are British Army patrols in dozens of Scottish boroughs in the late 1740s to the late 1750s, all the way down to the border. This is not a Highland pacification strategy. It's just that's the most infamous part of it.
I mentioned that the historical endgame of an establishment suddenly feeling comfortable that the crisis has passed. What were the key signs for the establishment that somehow the steam had gone out of this? Why did Jacobitism fail to establish its alternative? It was just firepower on behalf of the London establishment?
Well, it was actually the same reason ultimately. This is the story. I mean, in 1715, Mar made virtually every mistake in a military manual you could do. In fact, people should teach Mar at Sandhurst because he's absolutely everything you shouldn't do. You know, he divides his forces. He doesn't try to win a tactical victory to raise morale. He doesn't try to annihilate the enemy army. He succeeds in getting Argyll to lose 3 times as many men at Sheriffmuir as he does, and he still doesn't advance. I mean, you just can't make it up. And what's intended to be a diversionary rising in the northeast effectively becomes a hub of a second army with Mackintosh. But in 45, Charles and Stuart had the right idea, because the key problem was always, as it was in 1643, if you don't take London, you don't take the heart of the fiscal military state. And after the initial, this is why stopping at the border was a non-starter. After the initial successes, if you see the amount of money that Parliament is voting the Crown in the late months of end of 1745 and the early months of 1746, all the power of debt-financed military economy of an advanced kind, it was the most advanced debt-financed military economy in Europe, is being brought to bear. And that means you can buy in soldiers from abroad. You have to remember that even at Waterloo, only 28% of Wellington's troops were actually British Army. Just as the Americans, regard the Hessians with distaste even now, the long 18th century is a time when the British Army is actually packed out with people they've bought in. And they bought them in because they've got the financial power to do so. And that was what really helped them to gain ultimate victory. I think critically, although it wasn't understood right on the day itself, Culloden was really, really important because it was the first significant defeat of Jacobite military power in a Jacobite heartland area. I mean, there obviously was the defeat of 1719, but it was very much a small-scale spatchcock affair at Glen Shiel. This was the main army defeated on home territory, and that was a very significant development, and had, of course, with the what comes afterwards, massive long-term implications. Though, I'm just got to book with Oxford University Press. We plug, it's not here to sign, in process at present, Culloden, The Bath and History, Historiography and Popular Memory, in their new Great Battle series. I think one of the fascinating things about Culloden is that now the archival evidence, which I uncovered in the 90s, and the archaeological evidence uncovered in the last 10 years, quite clearly shows the Jacobites fired more musket balls at Culloden than the British Army, man for man. And the story of Culloden, I think the fascinating story that is, well, I think, fully uncovered in this book, is that actually Culloden is paradoxically a victory of British swords over Jacobite guns. It's dragoon cavalry. It's dragoon cavalry and their sabres that do the trick. They're far more operational cavalry, and that means they can outflank the Jacobite lines on the wings. So that's the key element in Culloden, not muskets against swords. One of the things that really bothered me as a scholar 25 years ago is all this stuff about, everyone will know it, muskets and swords. And then you look at just the records of Cumberland's British Army official captures in the aftermath. Taken from the field, 2,320 muskets and 190 swords. What? They carried their swords away with them, did they, in a catering pack? Come on. So why you have to ask, why has the history neglected the evidence for so long? So I think that's also part of the Jacobite story. No, that's covered a lot of ground, but it does tell you why the Jacobites are defeated. It's the numbers. It's the numbers game and the money game.
Well, here we are 300 years after a very significant moment in that trajectory, and we're still talking about it. What would you say is the legacy? Is a living legacy or is it a romantic legacy of Jacobitism?
Well, there obviously has been a romantic legacy, but I have to say I think there is, in some respects, and I'll get my head bitten off for this, a living legacy too. Now, that was particularly marked in Ireland, actually, where a lot of Jacobite rhetoric is transmuted into the rhetoric of the White Boys in 1798 and 19th century agricultural disturbance, and even the Irish volunteers, and that can be evidenced right the way through to the 1920s. There's a lot of Jacobite rhetoric, a Jacobite reading of the situation in Irish politics right the way through to the 20th century. In Scotland, obviously, it's the legacy is more the legacy of defeat and, crudely put, I suppose, the end of the Highland way of life. But there are key elements which are very close. One of them is that one of the things you find in the Jacobite movement is Scottish and Irish Jacobites are obsessed with getting the right constitutional settlement for Scotland and Ireland in a polity, and English Jacobites, just like English Whigs, just aren't very interested. So it's in that sense it's a classic foreshadowing of today. Constitutional change is an interest of national minorities within the British Isles, and that was as true in the Jacobite period as it is in 2015.
Well, I think that is a sentiment which is quite likely to produce a number of questions from the floor. So I wonder if we could organise a couple of microphones to wander around, and I'm sure Murray will elaborate on anything that you wish to ask him about. Now then, where shall we start? There's a gentleman right over there in the corner. Hello, sir.
Quite a lot of the money came from very wealthy Catholic Irish in France, Irish banks in Paris. Looking back in history, we forget actually how extraordinarily wealthy the Irish were, and including the Catholic Irish. They lost all that later. Secondly, this is a question: why do you think it is that after the 45 there are no Hanoverian songs, no Hanoverian poems, no Hanoverian romantic stories? Everything is from the Jacobite side. So culturally, there was another battle, if you think, in history, which the Hanoverian side didn't even play, it seems. And I think the cultural dimension is quite important. And the other question is, what was the influence in the period of, Hanoverian kingship of the Masonic and the reliability between officers on both sides, etc., and the Irish and Scottish rights and all that kind of stuff?
Right. This is one of these summarised Proust in 6 seconds questions, isn't it? I just as briefly as I can, and thank you for it. The Hanoverians were not widely supported. I mean, I don't mean that meant people are Jacobites. It's what you have if you look at the pattern of advances into England. I must remember that Charles II at Worcester at 1651 didn't get more English volunteers on the way down than Charles Edward did to Derby. Is that actually people, it's a bit like Richard III of Bosworth. People aren't that interested. They really don't. This is not a dynasty they care about. It's just a matter of, do you want the alternative? And quite a lot of people have got reservations about that and all the upheaval it means. But there's relatively little Hanoverian enthusiasm. The only exception, there are some loyal clubs that try to get loyal songs going. The only exception of successful loyal songs is really coming out of the Protestant minority in Ireland from 1689-91 onwards, because it's an existential struggle for them, and that creates its own song culture. But it's not, although in some ways it almost is an existential struggle for Great Britain in the Jacobite period. The Hanoverians are kind of there because they're the solution, but they're not a solution anyone particularly wants. They're just better than the alternative. So there's a lack of enthusiasm. Freemasonry is extremely interesting, and one of the key indicators about why we're wrong in looking in the 18th century at a time of freedom and open debate is it's also a time for the development of secret societies. It's a hugely important time for the development of secret societies, which Freemasonry is the most prominent. And yes, Scottish continental Jacobitism in particular is Scottish dominated at quite an early date. Unfortunately, James tries to get the Pope to ban Hanoverian Jacobitism, and he ends up having the Pope ban everything, which is a bit of a blow. That one's slightly misfired for the Jacobite cause. They were kind of looking to have a closed shop for their own brand of Freemasonry, ended up losing the lot. So that's when, for example, the Jacobite lodge in Rome becomes, for a time, the Society of Young Gentlemen Travellers, because it can't officially be a Jacobite lodge. But it maintains very strong links with the lodges in Scotland, particularly Canongate Kilwinning. And it's interesting that Sir Alexander Dick is one of the key links between the lodge in Rome and Canongate Kilwinning. And talking about the art market, it's well known that Alan Ramsay visited the Jacobite lodge, Alan Ramsay the painter, visited the Jacobite lodge in 1736 in Rome with Alexander Dick. But what I think isn't known is that he actually went back 3 times, that actually he went to nearly all the 1736 meetings of the Jacobite lodge. So it's a very important, Freemasonry is a very important part of cultural interchange for Jacobites in Scotland and the exilic community abroad.
The gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. I missed some of your talk, Professor, but did you draw attention to that wily old fox, Simon Lovett? And he was a man, I suppose, like Prestonfield, who always managed to get away with it. I think Broughton turned evidence against him, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And Lovett's problem was that for once, he kind of registered on the Ashley Madison site. I mean, he certainly did that. Would have done that as well, actually, but that's a different story. He wrote a note. Oops, saying I will raise the phrases. Oh dear, because he'd never done that before. And of course, there's a very nice novel which is I don't know if you know it, John Buchan's A Lost Lady of Old Years, which is exactly about Lovett's note and what happened to it. But yes, that was the basic problem. He confided himself to paper once, which was once too often.
This gentleman here.
I was very interested, Murray, in your comments about the centralisation in British polity after 1689. And it reminded me of your book, The Road to Independence, when you argue again, I think very convincingly, that centralisation post 1945 of the British state was one of the reasons that Scottish polity moved from being actually very right-wing in terms of its voting patterns pre-1945. And because of the centralisation and the lack of devolved institutions, if you like, or the sort of destruction, if you like, or the belittling of the devolved institutions, so that kind of grew again, and that led to the SNP, some of the growth of the FNP and the change in the left-leaning. I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, about the sort of same, whether there's any analogy there.
I think there is an analogy, because what has happened is, because there isn't a written constitution, there have been a series of constitutional quid pro quos, and they've been understood for a long time, and then they've been forgotten, because they can be forgotten, there's nothing written down, by new generations of politicians. And that's created unanticipated consequences, and what you're describing is one of them. But I'll give you one example, which is the Scottish colonizing experience and the international trade experience. Now, there were people prepared to recapitalize the Company of Africa after 1707. There's quite a lot of recent work on that. But the British government were very, very keen that there shouldn't be Scottish trading companies to rival the East India Company. However, what emerged that they were quite content with was, and this developed throughout the 17th and the 18th and 19th centuries, is that Scottish associations and Scottish groupings developed throughout the British Empire, and indeed in some other parts of the world. And those associations existed, let's not beat about the bush, to get Scots into jobs and to keep other people from the British Isles out of them, and to be an advanced kind of networking system for Scots throughout the world. And there are a lot of examples of that, and there are a lot of ceremonies that go with it, and there are Burns singing tours in the late 19th century, a whole range of stuff. Anyway, the issue is that projecting Scotland, look at the Empire exhibitions and the separate national representation of Scotland, look at Scotland as a British nation, as New Zealand is a British nation, in the Jubilee celebrations of Queen Victoria, in the imperial rhetoric and displays of the early 20th century. The point was Scotland could project itself nationally in certain limited ways, but the projection of Scotland nationally has collapsed after 1945. The loss of an international British identity, i.e. the British Empire, New Zealand and British, South African and British, Australian and British, the loss of international British identity has meant an increasing demand for homogenous identity within the UK, and an unwillingness and unhappiness with that kind of separate Scottish projection, which was such a feature of the 19th and 20th centuries. So that was, in a way, a kind of unwritten constitutional bargain. And it was suddenly really entirely taken away. And it was taken away not because there was a kind of plot by the Tories or anything. It was taken away because, politicians came from groups without that kind of memory, without that kind of understanding, without that kind of interest. And, I'd love to think that Scotland was widely, people in Great Britain generally were widely interested in Scotland, but I fear it's not the case. It was an embed with an elephant thing. The elephant rolled over. End of. But it had significant effects here.
There's a lady over here.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could explain to a non-Scot the shifting role of Roman Catholicism from 1715 onwards, and whether it's to do with the religious side or the cultural links to the continental mainland.
Well, first of all, there are fewer surviving Catholics as a proportion of the population in Scotland in the 18th century than there are in England. So it's a smaller percentage of the population. It's potentially very small indeed. Estimates range between 10 and 50,000 out of a population of 1.1 million. The vast majority of those are in the northeast of Scotland, particularly in Banffshire and in the West Highlands. But of course, what you do get is here and elsewhere the Maxwells. Kirkconnell, for example, you get Catholic families in situ in largely hostile, religiously hostile areas. So actually, Catholicism is kind of not a big issue in Scotland after 1707. What is a big issue is is Episcopalianism. And I'm not saying there was no crossover. There's been work done in England, but not in Scotland, really, on conforming church Catholics, people basically of Catholics who conformed to something that was a bit less threatening in public. And some Episcopalians definitely fall into that group. It's impossible to say how many. But Episcopalians were the people who were disenfranchised by the 1689 and 1707 settlements. So you're much more likely, as an Episcopalian, to support Jacobites in arms than you are as a Catholic, proportionately, because you're under much more surveillance as a Catholic. The risks that you're going to be found out are much higher. And it's only after 1745, when the Episcopalians get come down on like a ton of bricks, that that it becomes risky to be really risky to be an Episcopalian too. But they are the mainstay of Jacobite support in large areas of Scotland.
The gentleman there, just on the right.
I wonder if you might discuss how sincere the Stuart dynasty's commitment was to Scottish parliamentary independence. What do you think they really wanted, or was it just a kind of tactical move to muster support here?
I think in the question of James VII and II, there is extremely good evidence, even before, as he died before the Union, that he was anti-Union. And I think Alistair Mann's recent biography of James VII, the first biography of James the Scottish King, really brings that out. In the case of James VIII and III, he was completely and consistently against the Union in all his public declarations and private correspondence. Charles Edward Stuart is a little bit more dodgy. It's very difficult to actually pin down Charles Edward's politics on this one exactly, but just like his religion, they changed. I mean, basically, Charles has, especially after the failure of the 45, when he did, of course, repeal the Union by fiat at Edinburgh, but not by calling a free parliament, which some of his leadership objected to, not that there was much time to do that. But after that, he does wobble a bit, and partly he wobbles just as he wobbles in converting to the Church of England in 1750, in St Mary le Strand probably, because he's just desperate for anything at all that can get him back into power, and he basically thinks some of his more reserved stances in the Union are almost certainly driven by the fact that he basically thinks that without English Jacobites, he's had it. He always refuses any proposals of further landings in Scotland.
I think we have time for one more question, this gentleman here. There's a microphone coming.
Hello. Just to go back to Culloden and just after Culloden, you're saying the key defeat is in the Jacobite heartland. Yes. But Bonnie Prince Charlie wasn't killed or captured, and there was an escape underway, and wasn't there some sort of moves to regroup in the few days after that? And the possibility of more troops, was there a possibility of actually getting more men and more arms to carry that on, or really was it a done deal at that point?
Well, I think fundamentally it was a done deal. I mean, about 1,000 probably, we're not quite sure the numbers at Rutherford in Badenoch. There are 1,000 or so that later rally in the Western Highlands. But there are, first of all, despite what people sometimes say, these troops, and certainly the troops of Culloden, could not have carried out a guerrilla campaign, because to carry out a guerrilla campaign, you need food and drink. And the kind of areas that could be defended were not kind of heavy in food and drink, certainly not to sustain an army. And also, guerrilla warfare was not these people's tactics. There wasn't something they were used to anyway. So I think, but the key thing also was they'd lost control of all East Coast ports, and actually quite a lot of French material does come in after the deadline, and turns back. 3 squadrons of Fitzjames's horse are captured at sea by the Royal Navy because they can't actually land. They deliver. So if you lost all the ports, you've no means of supply. You've no real means of supply of arms. All you've got is occasional French ships who can take you off or land a few stand of muskets, and you've got no food, and you've got no drink, you could hold out during the summer in the West Highlands, but autumn and winter, cool, no. It wasn't practical, not given the number of boots the British Army were putting on the ground.
Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for making that swift transition from the chapel to here. You will all be checked for seditious signs as you leave.
That's right.
But most of all, Murray, thank you very much for opening up the world of Jacobitism and how we still feel its impact today. Thank you very much indeed.
And I should have really enlightened you all before that, of course, being the 300th anniversary, we do have quite a big Jacobite exhibition of the Traquair relation to the cause, which is up in the High Gallery if you make your way up there, or if not today, it's still until the end of September. And then in the museum room, we've got a fantastic collection of Jacobite glass, including a loan from the Drambuie glass collection. So if you do find it time to get into the house today, it's all there for you. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Catherine, for asking me, and for what a tremendous success this festival is. It's a credit to both you and Mark.